The sun hung high in the cloudless sky, casting a warm glow over the tranquil streets of Maplewood. This suburban oasis, with its neatly trimmed lawns and picturesque homes, was a testament to the American dream. On this particular Saturday, the air buzzed with the promise of summer adventure, and two young siblings were about to embark on their own. Maya and Jordan Bennett, aged 10 and 12 respectively, had spent weeks planning for this day. Their dining room table had become a war room of sorts, covered in crayon-scribbled business plans and hand-drawn posters. Their mission, to set up the most spectacular lemonade stand Maplewood had ever seen. But this wasn't just about making a quick buck for new toys or video games. No, Maya and Jordan had bigger plans. They had learned about a local charity that provided school supplies to underprivileged kids, and the thought of other children not having the basic tools for learning had struck a chord with them. With unwavering determination, they decided that every penny earned from their lemonade stand would go towards this noble cause. As the clock struck noon, Maya and Jordan lugged their makeshift stand to the sidewalk in front of their house. It wasn't much to look at, just a folding table draped with a checkered tablecloth that had seen better days. But to the Bennett siblings, it was their ticket to making a difference. Jordan, the older of the two, took charge of setting up the stand. His freckled face scrunched in concentration as he carefully arranged the plastic cups and napkins. Maya, her braids bouncing with each step, busied herself with hanging up their painstakingly crafted signs. "Lemonade for a cause," one proclaimed in bold, glittery letters. Jordan handled the transaction, his chest puffing with pride as he dropped Mrs. Goldstein's money into their repurposed cookie jar. "Thank you, Mrs. Goldstein," they chorused as she took her first sip. My, Mrs. Goldstein said, smacking her lips appreciatively. "This is delicious. Did you make it yourselves?" Jordan nodded eagerly. "Mom helped us with the recipe, but we did all the mixing." As Mrs. Goldstein chatted with the children, more neighbors began to stop by. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street bought a glass, praising the kids for their initiative. The Johnson twins, barely older than Maya, emptied their piggy banks to contribute to the cause. The afternoon wore on, and the lemonade stand became a hub of activity. Parents with strollers, joggers taking a breather, and kids on bikes all stopped to sample the Bennett siblings' wares and learn about their mission. Maya and Jordan worked tirelessly, pouring glasses, making change, and explaining their charity to anyone who would listen. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the street, Maya and Jordan exchanged excited glances. Their cookie jar was nearly full, and they had gone through almost all of their lemonade. It had been a resounding success. But just as they were about to start packing up, a shadow fell across their stand. Looking up, they saw a woman they recognized but didn't know well, Karen Mathis from down the block. Unlike the other neighbors, Karen wasn't smiling. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes held a look of disapproval that made both Maya and Jordan squirm uncomfortably. "What's going on here?" Karen demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cheerful atmosphere like a knife. Maya and Jordan exchanged nervous glances. They had heard stories about Karen from other kids in the neighborhood. She was known for her strict adherence to rules and her tendency to complain about the smallest infractions. "We're selling lemonade for charity," Jordan explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "Would you like to buy a glass?" Karen's frown deepened. "Do you have a permit for this?" she asked, her tone accusatory. The siblings' confusion was evident on their faces. Maya looked at Jordan, silently pleading for him to handle this unexpected challenge. "A permit?" Jordan repeated, his voice wavering slightly. "It's just lemonade, ma'am. We're trying to help kids get school supplies." But Karen was not to be swayed by their good intentions. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the humble stand, taking in the hand-drawn signs and the jar full of money. "This is illegal," she declared, her voice rising. "You can't just set up shop wherever you want. I'm calling the police if you don't pack this up right now." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon. Maya's eyes widened in shock, while Jordan's face paled. The idea that their innocent fundraiser could be considered illegal had never crossed their minds. But we're not hurting anyone, Maya protested weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen, however, was already pulling out her phone, her fingers flying over the keypad with determined precision. The siblings watched in stunned silence, their dream of helping others crumbling before their eyes. As Karen began to speak into her phone, her voice loud and insistent, Maya and Jordan shared a look of helpless dismay. Their perfect summer day had taken an unexpected and frightening turn, and they didn't know how to make it right. The peaceful hum of the suburban afternoon was shattered by Karen's strident voice as she spoke into her phone. "Yes, I need to report an illegal business operation," she declared, her words carrying across the suddenly silent street. Maya and Jordan stood frozen behind their lemonade stand, their young faces a mixture of confusion and growing fear. Karen paced back and forth on the sidewalk, her free hand gesticulating wildly as she continued her tirade. "There are children here, running an unlicensed business. It's causing a disturbance in the neighborhood. I demand immediate action." The dispatcher on the other end of the line, accustomed to all manner of calls, struggled to maintain their professional composure. "Ma'am, could you please clarify the nature of this illegal business?" "It's a lemonade stand," Karen practically shouted, as if the very words were an affront to decency. "Ah, they're selling beverages without proper licensing or health inspections. Who knows what could be in that lemonade? It's a public health hazard." As Karen's voice rose, so did the attention of the neighbors. Curtains twitched in nearby windows, and a few brave souls ventured out onto their front lawns, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Goldstein, who had been one of the first customers earlier, emerged from her house with a look of concern etched on her kindly face. "What's going on here?" she asked, approaching the scene with cautious steps. Her eyes darted between Karen's rigid stance and the bewildered children behind the stand. Karen, still on the phone, held up a hand to silence Mrs. Goldstein. "Yes, that's right," she continued, speaking to the dispatcher. "I want an officer here immediately. This is about law and order in our community." Jordan, finding a shred of courage, stepped out from behind the stand. "Please, Mrs. Mathis," he pleaded, his voice quavering. "We're just trying to raise money for charity. We didn't mean to cause any trouble." But Karen was beyond reasoning. She turned her back on the children, lowering her voice as she provided more details to the dispatcher. The siblings could only catch snippets of her conversation, words like loitering and public nuisance floating on the warm summer air. Maya, her eyes brimming with tears, fumbled for her phone. With trembling fingers, she typed out a desperate text to their father, Thomas Bennett. "Dad, there's a lady here saying she's calling the cops on us for selling lemonade. Can you come?" As she hit send, Maya looked up to see more neighbors gathering. Some wore expressions of confusion, others of sympathy. A few even looked angry. But whether at Karen or the children, it was hard to tell. Mr. Rodriguez, who had bought lemonade earlier, approached Karen with a furrowed brow. "Come on, Karen," he said, his voice low and reasonable. "They're just kids. Is this really necessary?" Karen whirled on him, her eyes flashing. "Necessary? Of course it's necessary. If we let this slide, what's next? We have rules for a reason, Frank. Without them, there's chaos." As the adults argued, Maya and Jordan huddled closer together behind their stand. The cheerful signs they had made now seemed to mock them. The promise of doing good turned sour by one woman's rigid adherence to rules. "What should we do?" Maya whispered to her brother, her voice tight with worry. Jordan, trying to put on a brave face for his little sister, shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe we should start packing up." But before they could make a move, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the air. Karen's call had been answered, and the full weight of the law was descending upon their little lemonade stand. The siren grew louder, and soon a police cruiser turned onto their street, its lights flashing. The gathered neighbors fell silent, all eyes turning to watch as the car pulled up to the curb. As the officer stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his cap and surveying the scene, Karen strode forward, eager to present her case. The children, rooted to the spot, could only watch as she gestured emphatically towards their stand, her words tumbling out in a rush of righteous indignation. The officer, a man named Davis according to his nameplate, listened patiently to Karen's tirade. His eyes, however, kept drifting to the lemonade stand and the two young, frightened faces behind it. When Karen finally paused for breath, Officer Davis held up a hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and measured, "let me assess the situation." He walked over to the stand, his approach slow and non-threatening. "Hello there," he said to Maya and Jordan, crouching down slightly to meet their eyes. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" Jordan, summoning all his courage, spoke up. "We're selling lemonade, sir, for charity, to help kids get school supplies." Officer Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I see. And do you have permission from your parents to be doing this?" Maya, finding her voice, nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Our dad knows we're here. He helped us set everything up this morning." As the officer continued to question the children gently, Karen hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a mask of frustration and impatience. "Officer," she interrupted, "are you going to do something about this or not? Rules are rules. It's not fair for the rest of us if they can just break them whenever they want." Officer Davis straightened up, turning to face Karen. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of squealing tires drew everyone's attention. A sleek black sedan had pulled up behind the police cruiser, its engine purring softly. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall, imposing figure that made Karen's eyes widen in recognition. Thomas Bennett, the children's father and the county's district attorney, had arrived on the scene. His face was composed, but his eyes blazed with determination as he surveyed the scene before him. The atmosphere, already tense, seemed to crackle with new energy. As Thomas strode towards the group, his presence commanding attention, it was clear that this confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. Maya and Jordan, relief flooding their faces, ran to their father. "Dad!" Maya cried, throwing her arms around him. "She called the cops on us!" Thomas knelt down, embracing both his children. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm here now. Let me handle this." As he stood up, Thomas's gaze swept over the assembled group, the bewildered officer, the gathering neighbors, and Karen, whose defiant stance seemed to waver slightly in the face of this new arrival. Thomas Bennett took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The simple act of selling lemonade had escalated into something far more complex, touching on issues of community, law, and the sometimes fine line between order and compassion. As he prepared to address the situation, Thomas knew that his words and actions in the next few moments would have repercussions far beyond this single summer afternoon. Officer Davis, caught between Karen's insistent demands and the unexpected arrival of the district attorney, found himself in an increasingly delicate situation. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the scene. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Thomas nodded curtly, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group before settling on the officer. "I received a distressed message from my daughter," he explained, his tone measured, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Naturally, I came as quickly as I could." Karen, momentarily taken aback by Thomas's arrival, quickly recovered her indignation. She stepped forward, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice clipped, "I hope you're here to put an end to this illegal operation. Your children may be well-intentioned, but rules exist for a reason." Thomas turned to face Karen, his expression unreadable. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Karen Mathis," she replied, drawing herself up to her full height. "I'm the one who reported this situation." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Karen's face. "I see. And what exactly is the nature of this situation, Mrs. Mathis?" Karen launched into her explanation, her words tumbling out in a rush of self-righteousness. Your children are running an unlicensed business on public property. They're selling beverages without proper health inspections or permits. It's a clear violation of local ordinances and a potential public health risk." As Karen spoke, Thomas's gaze drifted to the lemonade stand. The colorful signs proclaiming "Lemonade for a Cause" and detailing the charitable nature of their endeavor stood in stark contrast to Karen's dire warnings. "Officer Davis," Thomas said, turning back to the policeman, "could you please explain the exact complaint you received? I'm curious about the urgency that prompted sending a squad car to investigate a children's lemonade stand." Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the tension in the air. "Well, sir, we received a call about an unlicensed business operation causing a disturbance. Given the vague nature of the complaint, I was dispatched to assess the situation." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A disturbance? I see." He turned to address the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. "Has anyone here felt disturbed or threatened by my children's lemonade stand?" A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Goldstein, the retired teacher, stepped forward. "Disturbed? Heavens, no! I thought it was a lovely initiative. The children were so polite, and the lemonade was delicious." Mr. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "They're not bothering anyone. If anything, it's brought the neighborhood together. I've had more conversations with my neighbors today than I have all month." Karen, sensing the tide turning against her, interjected forcefully. "It doesn't matter if they're not actively disturbing anyone. The law is the law. We can't just pick and choose which rules to follow based on how cute or well-intentioned the violators are." Thomas held up a hand, silencing Karen's outburst. He turned back to Officer Davis, his voice calm but authoritative. "Officer, in your professional opinion, do you believe my children's lemonade stand poses a genuine threat to public safety or order?" Officer Davis hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Well, Mr. Bennett, technically there are regulations about unlicensed food and beverage sales. But in my experience, these rules are typically enforced for large-scale operations or persistent offenders. A children's lemonade stand." He trailed off, shrugging slightly. "I understand." Thomas nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I appreciate your candor, Officer Davis. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to address the core issue here." He turned to face Karen, his posture straight and commanding. The years he had spent in courtrooms, facing down hardened criminals and corrupt officials, lent him an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Karen, despite her earlier bravado, seemed to shrink slightly under his gaze. "Mrs. Mathis," Thomas began, his voice level but intense, "I understand your concern for rules and regulations. As a public servant myself, I share your respect for the law. However, the law is not a blunt instrument to be wielded indiscriminately. It's a framework designed to protect and serve our community." Karen opened her mouth to interject, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "Please, allow me to finish. The spirit of the law is just as important as its letter. The regulations you're so concerned about were put in place to prevent exploitation and ensure public safety. Do you truly believe that my children's charitable lemonade stand falls into the category of activities these laws were designed to prevent?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Karen looked uncertain. Thomas pressed on, his voice softening slightly. "Moreover, before escalating to involving law enforcement, did you consider the impact of your actions? Did you think about how this might affect these children, who were simply trying to do something good for their community?" Karen's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and lingering defiance. I was just trying to uphold the rules," she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating under Thomas's measured words. Thomas nodded, acknowledging her statement. "I understand that, Mrs. Mathis, but rules without compassion can lead to injustice. In your zeal to enforce the letter of the law, you risked crushing the very spirit of community and civic responsibility that we should be nurturing in our youth." He turned to address the gathered neighbors, his voice carrying easily across the now silent street. "Look around you. This lemonade stand has brought our community together on this beautiful summer day. It's taught these children valuable lessons about entrepreneurship, charity, and civic engagement. Are these not the very values we want to encourage? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Goldstein nodded vigorously, while Mr. Rodriguez gave a thumbs up. Even Officer Davis seemed to be nodding slightly, though he quickly schooled his features back into professional neutrality. Thomas turned back to Karen, his expression softening further. Mrs. Mathis, I invite you to reconsider your position. Instead of seeing this as a violation to be punished, why not view it as an opportunity to support our community's youth? Your attention to detail and knowledge of local regulations could be invaluable in guiding these young entrepreneurs, ensuring they learn how to navigate the complexities of civic life responsibly. Karen blinked, clearly taken aback by this unexpected turn. The anger and indignation that had fueled her earlier actions seemed to drain away, leaving her looking somewhat lost. I hadn't thought of it that way, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled, a genuine warmth replacing the stern authority he had displayed earlier. Bye. It's never too late to change our perspective, Mrs. Mathis. What do you say? Would you be willing to channel your passion for rules and order into mentoring these young citizens instead of punishing them? A hush fell over the gathered crowd as they waited for Karen's response. Maya and Jordan, who had been watching the exchange with wide-eyed amazement, held their breath. This woman, who had seemed so frightening and unreasonable just moments ago, now looked vulnerable and human. After what seemed like an eternity, Karen nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I could do that, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I do have experience with permit applications and health regulations. Perhaps I could help them set up a proper stand for future events. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood seemed to dissolve in an instant. Smiles broke out on faces throughout the crowd, and a smattering of applause erupted. Maya and Jordan exchanged shocked but delighted glances, hardly able to believe the sudden turn of events. Thomas beamed, clapping a hand on Karen's shoulder. That's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Mathis. I'm sure Maya and Jordan would be grateful for your expertise. He turned to his children, raising an eyebrow in question. What do you two think? Would you like Mrs. Mathis's help in making your lemonade stand officially recognized by the city? Jordan, always the more outspoken of the two, nodded enthusiastically. That would be amazing. We could make it even bigger next time, maybe set up in the park for the 4th of July celebration. Maya, still a bit shy, smiled and added, and we could raise even more money for the school supplies charity. Karen, who had been watching the children warily, what had started as a tense confrontation had evolved into an impromptu community meeting, with neighbors chiming in with offers of support and suggestions for future charitable events. Officer Davis, seeing that his presence was no longer needed, tipped his hat to Thomas. Well, Mr. Bennett, it seems you've resolved this situation quite admirably. I'll be on my way, unless there's anything else you need. Thomas shook his head, extending a hand to the officer. Thank you for your professionalism, Officer Davis. I appreciate your measured approach to this unique situation. As the police cruiser pulled away, its lights no longer flashing, Thomas turned back to survey the scene. The lemonade stand, which had been the center of so much controversy, was now surrounded by chattering neighbors. Karen was deep in conversation with Mrs. Goldstein, discussing the logistics of expanding the charitable initiative. Maya and Jordan, their earlier fear forgotten, were excitedly describing their plans to Mr. Rodriguez and a group of other interested adults. Thomas felt a swell of pride as he watched his children navigate this unexpected turn of events with grace and enthusiasm. What had begun as a simple summer project had turned into a valuable lesson in civic engagement, conflict resolution, and the power of community. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the scene, Thomas knew that this day would be remembered not for the conflict that had erupted, but for the way the neighborhood had come together to transform a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth and connection. He made his way over to the lemonade stand, where Maya was carefully pouring a glass for Karen. The woman accepted it with a smile that, while still a bit uncertain, was genuine. As Thomas approached, Karen turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "I owe you and your children an apology. I was so caught up in the rules that I lost sight of what's truly important in a community." Thomas nodded, accepting her words with grace. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Mathis. What matters is how we learn and grow from them. I think today has been a learning experience for all of us." As the evening wore on, the impromptu gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without really knowing each other were now engaged in animated conversations. Plans were being made for future events, not just lemonade stands, but a whole series of community-building activities. Maya and Jordan, despite the excitement, were beginning to show signs of fatigue after their eventful day. Thomas, noticing their drooping eyelids, decided it was time to wrap things up. "All right, everyone," he called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I think it's time we called it a day. Maya and Jordan need their rest, and I'm sure we all have dinner to think about." There were good-natured groans from the assembled neighbors, but they began to disperse, calling out final suggestions and farewells as they headed home. Karen lingered, helping the children pack up their stand. "I'll be in touch about those permits," she promised, her earlier severity replaced by an almost grandmotherly warmth. "We'll make sure your next event is the talk of the town, for all the right reasons." As the last of the neighbors departed and the street returned to its usual quiet, Thomas helped his children carry the remnants of their stand back to the house. The cookie jar, now full of donations, clinked with each step. "You two did good today," Thomas said as they reached their front porch. "You stood up for yourselves. You didn't let fear stop you from doing what you believed in, and you showed everyone the power of a simple act of kindness." Maya and Jordan beamed at their father's praise. As they stepped into the house, the warm glow of the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they knew that this was just the beginning. Their little lemonade stand had set something in motion, something that promised to change their neighborhood for the better. And as for Karen, well, she had a lot of thinking to do. But as she walked home that evening, she found herself smiling, already making plans for how she could help make the next community event a roaring success. Sometimes, she realized, it took a glass of lemonade and a lesson in compassion to remind us of what truly matters in life. As weeks turned into months, the impact of that fateful summer day continued to ripple through the community of Maplewood. What had started as a simple lemonade stand had blossomed into a catalyst for change, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. Maya and Jordan, emboldened by their experience, threw themselves into community service with renewed vigor. Their lemonade stand, now a regular fixture at local events, had expanded into a small empire of charitable initiatives. With Karen's guidance, they had navigated the complexities of permits and health regulations, turning their summer project into a year-round operation. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the siblings found themselves setting up their stand at the annual Maplewood Fall Festival. Their table, once a simple fold-out affair, now boasted a professional banner proclaiming Bennett's Charitable Refreshments. Next to the lemonade pitcher stood a new addition, a steaming urn of hot apple cider, perfect for the cooling weather. As Jordan carefully arranged cups and napkins, Maya looked up to see a familiar face approaching. "Mrs. Mathis," she called out, waving enthusiastically. "Come try our new cider recipe." Karen Mathis, her hair now streaked with more gray than when they'd first met, smiled warmly as she approached the stand. Gone was the stern, rule-obsessed woman who had once called the police on them. In her place stood a committed mentor and advocate for youth entrepreneurship. "Well, well," Karen said, her eyes twinkling as she surveyed their setup. "You two have certainly come a long way from that first stand. I'm impressed." Jordan beamed with pride. "We couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Mathis. Your help with the paperwork and regulations has been amazing." Karen waved off the compliment, but her pleased expression betrayed her true feelings. "Nonsense. You two had the drive and the heart. I just helped with the boring bits." She leaned in conspiratorially. "Now, how about that cider? I hear it's the talk of the festival." As Maya poured a steaming cup for Karen, a small crowd began to gather around their stand. Word had spread about the Bennett siblings, delicious beverages, and their charitable cause. Soon, a line had formed, with festival goers chatting amiably as they waited their turn. Thomas Bennett, watching from a short distance away, felt a swell of pride. His children had taken a potential disaster and turned it into an opportunity for growth, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. He noticed how Maya and Jordan interacted with their customers, confident, articulate, and always emphasizing the charitable aspect of their work. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself in conversation with Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Goldstein, who had become regular supporters of the children's initiatives. "You know," Mrs. Goldstein mused, sipping her cider, "I've lived in Maplewood for over 40 years, and I've never seen the community so united. These kids have really brought us together." Mr. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "It's not just the lemonade stand either. Remember the book drive they organized for the library, and the cleanup day at the park? They've inspired a lot of people to get involved." Thomas listened, a thoughtful expression on his face. "They've certainly grown a lot since that first day," he said. "I think we all have." As if on cue, Karen joined their group, clutching her empty cider cup. "Thomas," she said, a note of excitement in her voice, "I've been thinking. The success of Maya and Jordan's project has me wondering, what if we could replicate this in other neighborhoods? Create a sort of youth entrepreneurship program across the county?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's an interesting idea, Karen. What did you have in mind?" As Karen launched into an explanation of her vision, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The woman who had once been the neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer was now proposing a county-wide initiative to empower young people. It was a change he would never have predicted that tumultuous summer day. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the lemonade stand. A local news crew had arrived, setting up cameras and preparing to interview Maya and Jordan. The siblings, initially wide-eyed with surprise, quickly composed themselves, smoothing their aprons and standing up straight. Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and amusement as his children fielded questions from the reporter with poise and confidence. They spoke about their charitable goals, the support they'd received from the community, and their plans for the future. "Mookie, and what would you say to other kids who want to make a difference in their communities?" the reporter asked, holding the microphone out to Maya. Maya paused for a moment, her young face serious. "I'd say, don't be afraid to start small. Our big project started with just a lemonade stand, and don't let setbacks stop you. Sometimes, the people who seem like they're against you at first can become your biggest supporters." At this, she glanced over at Karen, who was watching the interview with tears glistening in her eyes. The cameraman, noticing the interaction, swung his lens to capture Karen's reaction. As the interview wrapped up, Thomas found himself reflecting on the incredible journey they'd all been on. A simple act of childhood entrepreneurship had sparked a chain reaction, leading to strengthened community bonds, personal growth, and now, potentially, a county-wide youth program. He caught snippets of their conversations. What if we did a car wash for the animal shelter? Maybe we could organize a talent show to raise money for the hospital. It seemed that Maya and Jordan's example had ignited a spark in their peers. The next generation of community leaders was already forming, inspired by two kids who had dared to set up a lemonade stand and stand their ground. As they loaded the last of the equipment into their car, Maya tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Dad," she said, her voice tired but happy, "do you think we made a difference today?" Thomas knelt down, looking his daughter in the eye. "Maya," he said softly, "you and Jordan have been making a difference every day since you set up that first stand. Never doubt the power of a small act of kindness. It can change the world." As they drove home through the darkening streets of Maplewood, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism for the future. The lemonade stand incident, which had seemed like such a crisis at the time, had set in motion a series of events that were reshaping their community for the better. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his children, both dozing in the back seat after their long day. Maya and Jordan had learned valuable lessons about perseverance, community engagement, and the importance of standing up for what they believed in. But perhaps more importantly, they had taught those same lessons to everyone around them: neighbors, peers, and even the adults who were supposed to be guiding them. As they pulled into their driveway, Thomas made a mental note to call the mayor in the morning. Karen's idea for a youth entrepreneurship program had merit, and he was in a position to help make it a reality. Who knew? Maybe someday, every neighborhood would have its own lemonade stand story, a tale of conflict turned to cooperation, of rules balanced with compassion, and of a community coming together to support its youngest members. The Bennett family's lemonade stand had started as a simple summer project, but its true product wasn't lemonade or even the money raised for charity. It was the strengthened bonds of a community, the growth of young leaders, and the reminder that even the smallest actions can lead to profound change. As Thomas carried his sleeping children into the house, he couldn't help but smile. The future, he realized, was bright, and it tasted a lot like lemonade. 5 years had passed since that fateful summer day when a lemonade stand had nearly torn apart the community of Maplewood. Now, on a warm June morning, the town square was bustling with activity as people gathered for the inaugural Maplewood Youth Entrepreneurship Fair. Colorful booths lined the square, each staffed by eager young faces ready to showcase their business ideas and community projects. At the center of it all stood a familiar sight: the Bennett siblings' lemonade stand, now a full-fledged kiosk with a professional banner reading Bennett's Refreshments Community Outreach. Maya, now 15, and Jordan, 17E, moved with confidence as they managed their operation. They were no longer just selling lemonade. Their stand had become a hub for community information, offering pamphlets on local charities and upcoming events alongside their refreshing beverages. As the fair's opening ceremony began, Thomas Bennett took the stage. His hair now peppered with gray, but his eyes still bright with the same passion that had driven him to defend his children's lemonade stand years ago. "Welcome, everyone, to Maplewood's first Youth Entrepreneurship Fair," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, a simple lemonade stand sparked a controversy in our community. Today, that same stand stands as a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together, when we balance rules with compassion, and when we empower our youth to make a difference. Thomas gestured to the sea of young faces before him. "Look around you. Every booth you see here today represents a dream, an idea that could change our community for the better. This fair is the culmination of years of hard work, not just by these young entrepreneurs, but by every member of our community who supported them, guided them, and believed in them." As Thomas spoke, Karen Matis stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes glistening with tears of pride. The program she had proposed 5 years ago had grown beyond her wildest dreams, spreading to communities across the county and even inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring states. "And now," Thomas continued, "I'd like to invite the 2 young people who started it all to say a few words. Maya and Jordan Bennett. Would you please join me on stage?" The crowd erupted in applause as Maya and Jordan made their way to the podium. They had grown so much since that first lemonade stand, not just in height but in confidence and poise. Jordan spoke first, his voice deep with the onset of adulthood. "When we set up our first stand, we just wanted to raise some money for charity. We had no idea it would lead to all of this." He gestured to the fair around them. But what we learned that day was that even the smallest actions can have a big impact." Maya nodded, picking up where her brother left off. "We also learned the importance of standing up for what you believe in, even when faced with opposition. But most importantly, we learned that when a community comes together, amazing things can happen." As the siblings continued to speak, sharing anecdotes and thanking those who had supported them along the way, Thomas found himself scanning the crowd. He saw Mrs. Goldstein, now using a cane, but still beaming with pride at the young entrepreneurs. Mr. Rodriguez stood nearby, his own children now running a booth selling homemade crafts to support the local animal shelter. And there, In the front row was Officer Davis, long since retired, but still a fixture in the community. He caught Thomas's eye and gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd all come since that tense confrontation years ago. As Maya and Jordan concluded their speech to thunderous applause, Thomas stepped back to the microphone for a final word. Before we officially open the fair, there's one more person I'd like to recognize. Someone who taught us all a valuable lesson about the power of changing perspectives and the importance of channeling our passions into positive action. Karen Mathis, would you please join us on stage? A hush fell over the crowd as Karen made her way up the steps, her face a mix of surprise and emotion. As she reached the podium, Thomas handed her the microphone. Karen took a deep breath, looking out over the sea of faces. 5 years ago, I was the villain in a story about a lemonade stand, she began, her voice shaky, but gaining strength. I was so focused on rules and regulations that I lost sight of what truly matters. Community, compassion, and nurturing the dreams of our young people. She turned to Maya and Jordan, her eyes brimming with tears. These two remarkable young people, and their father, taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. They showed me that it's never too late to change, to learn, and to become a force for good in your community. As Karen spoke, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the transformative power of that single summer day. What had started as a conflict had blossomed into a movement, changing not just their community, but the lives of everyone involved. The ceremony concluded with a ribbon cutting, officially opening the fair. As the crowd dispersed to explore the booths, Thomas found himself back at the Bennett's lemonade stand, now manned by a group of younger children, whom Maya and Jordan were mentoring. "Well, Dad," Jordan said, appearing at his side with a glass of lemonade. "What do you think? Did we make a difference?" Thomas took the glass, looking from his son to the bustling fair around them. He saw the excited faces of young entrepreneurs, the proud smiles of parents and mentors, and the strong bonds of a community united in support of its youth. "You know, Jordan," he said, taking a sip of the lemonade, "I think you and Maya did more than make a difference. You started a revolution, armed with nothing more than lemons, sugar, and an unshakable belief in doing good." As the day wore on, the Maplewood Youth Entrepreneurship Fair buzzed with energy and promise. Ideas were shared, connections were made, and dreams were born. And at the heart of it all was a simple lemonade stand, a reminder that even the smallest actions, done with passion and perseverance, have the power to change the world. The sun began to set on Maplewood, casting a warm glow over the town square. As the fair wound down and people began to head home, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. This wasn't just the end of a successful event, it was the beginning of a new chapter for the community. Maya and Jordan, tired but elated, began to pack up their stand. As they worked, a young girl approached them, her eyes wide with admiration. "Excuse me," she said shyly, "but I heard your story about how you started with just a lemonade stand. Do you think I could do something like that too?" Maya knelt down to the girl's level, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Of course you can," she said softly. "All it takes is an idea, some hard work, and the courage to stand up for what you believe in. What would you like to do?" As the girl began to excitedly share her ideas, Thomas watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Karen standing beside him. "We did good, didn't we?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he found his voice. "We did, Karen. We really did." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the Bennett family and Karen walked together towards home. The lemonade stand that had once been a source of conflict now stood as a beacon of hope, a symbol of what can be achieved when a community comes together. And in homes across Maplewood that night, young minds dreamed of lemonade stands and so much more, of a future where their ideas could flourish, supported by a community that believed in the power of youth, compassion, and a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit. the lemonade stand incident had come full circle. What had begun as a simple summer project had transformed a community, changed lives, and set in motion a movement that would continue to inspire generations to come. In the end, it wasn't just about selling lemonade. It was about the sweet taste of making a difference, one glass at a time. As Maplewood settled into the quiet of the evening, the legacy of that fateful summer day lived on, in the strengthened bonds of a community, in the confidence of its young people, and in the hearts of all those who had learned that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest of actions. And so, the story of the Bennett siblings' lemonade stand became more than just a tale of summer entrepreneurship. It became a legend in Maplewood, a reminder that with passion, perseverance, and a willingness to see beyond rules to the heart of what truly matters, anyone, no matter how young or how small their beginnings, can make a lasting impact on the world around them. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Maplewood slept, its dreams a little sweeter, its future a little brighter, all thanks to a simple glass of lemonade and the incredible journey it inspired.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.